Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're starting a brand new program entitled Cumulative Trauma and the QME. And I've been meaning to bring this program to you and discuss these topics for a long time. But for many reasons, this project just kept getting pushed to the back burner. And now it's risen to the top of the pile, and I'm glad to be able to bring to you this discussion regarding cumulative trauma and the QME, because it seems that QMEs have great difficulties in understanding how to accurately opine and how to accurately resolve disputed issues in those claims that involve allegations of cumulative trauma. And cumulative trauma allegations are becoming more and more frequent. And in fact, if you look over the last 8 to 10 evaluations that have come across your desk, you'll probably ascertain and determine that probably 7 out of 10 of those evaluations involved some allegation of cumulative trauma. And it seems that allegations of cumulative trauma injuries have a tendency to result in a denial by the claims administrator. So many times these CT claims come to us as denied claims. And qualified medical evaluators tell me that they struggle in arriving at accurate determinations, first and foremost on AOE-COE, in other words, in arriving at an accurate opinion on compensability under Labor Code 4060. But in those cases that involve an accepted claim for cumulative trauma injury, qualified medical evaluators continue their struggles in arriving at accurate impairment determinations, and then also and specifically in arriving at accurate apportionment approximate percentages when in cases that involve cumulative trauma, many factors contribute to the final permanent impairment rating. So qualified medical evaluators struggle in arriving at accurate apportionment approximate percentages. So in this program, I want to share with you and discuss with you many of the issues that surround these cumulative trauma claims and provide to you some direction and some principles upon which you can rely when it becomes your turn to opine on the difficult issues involving AOE-COE, permanent impairment, and apportionment approximate percentages in those claims that involve an allegation of cumulative trauma. So let me begin by sharing with you some important statistics and some features of cumulative trauma injury claims that will serve as our foundation for moving forward in this discussion. So as you're probably already aware, the proportion of claims involving allegations of cumulative trauma have increased sharply, and I have some statistics to share with you beginning back in 2008 and coming up into current, at least as current as the statistics are currently known. Now, interestingly, cumulative trauma claims can involve a long delay between the date of occurrence of the injury and the date of the filing of the claim. In other words, the injury can occur, for example, in 2018, and the claim cannot be filed until much later, perhaps in 2019, 2020, 2021. And so for those reasons, many times, the statistics relating to cumulative trauma claims are incomplete and are not fully realized until many years after the date of injury of the cumulative trauma injury. So the statistics that I'm going to share with you come up and through 2016 to 2017, and as this video is being recorded in 2021, those statistics, 2016 and 2017, are the most recent and most accurate recent statistics that we have available to us because of this potential long delay. Now, interestingly, and this is important for us as qualified medical evaluators, and this is one area where some of the difficulty that qualified medical evaluators have originates, and it's because cumulative trauma can have exposure over years or even decades But the liability for cumulative trauma claims is generally spread over the last year of injurious exposure. So you may get a request for an evaluation for an allegation of cumulative trauma, say for example from 1/1/2015 through 12/31/2020, a 5-year injurious exposure with the same employer, during which time the employer may have 2, may have 3, may have multiple insurers over each of those policy years. And this is where, for you as a qualified medical evaluator, the pressure is on you, the onus is on you to come up with accurate determinations so that liability can be assessed to the appropriate insurer. And you can imagine that there's going to be great interest from the multiple insurers to ensure that liability is placed on someone other than them. And so this is another area where difficulty arises in these cumulative trauma claims, is in assessing and assigning the liability for the injury to the appropriate employer. And not only that, but assigning or assessing the appropriate liability for the permanent impairment through your apportionment determination to the appropriate insurer. And this is an area where there's always great contention. As you know, cumulative trauma claims are more likely than specific injury claims, that is, to involve multiple body parts. And I know that you're familiar with this. You get a case, a denied case, a claim that's been denied with an allegation of cumulative trauma. Perhaps it's a post-employment cumulative trauma claim, and every body part of the entire body is listed as an injured body part, including neuromusculoskeletal injuries, including internal medicine injuries, including psychiatric injuries, and every single body part is claimed as being involved in the cumulative trauma injury. So this becomes very difficult for qualified medical evaluators to have to do an evaluation of multiple body parts. And I have some ideas to share with you that will greatly simplify your evaluation of those claims, especially those claims that involve multiple body parts. So stay tuned for that. As you know, cumulative trauma claims are more likely to involve representation by an applicant attorney. In fact, we rarely get a claim, a request for an evaluation for a claim of cumulative trauma by an unrepresented injured worker. In fact, I'm going back in my recent files to assess these past evaluations. And number one, very few evaluations anymore involve unrepresented injured workers. They're not totally non-existent, but they are the minority of the cases that we get. But of those cases that involve unrepresented injured workers, almost 100% of those, at least in my files, are for allegations of specific incidences of injury versus an allegation for cumulative trauma to multiple body parts. So you're familiar with this. You're going to be getting cover letters from both the applicant attorney and from the defense attorney. And specifically, the applicant attorney is going to be keen to your opinions and conclusions, first and foremost, on AOE, COE, and then second on your apportionment approximate percentages, so that, number one, you do opine for industrial injury in those cases, and then number two, that you assign the majority or all of the permanent impairment to the employer versus 0% due to other factors. So these are cases that are going to be keenly scrutinized by both the defense attorney and by the applicant attorney. And then finally, and this is where we come in as qualified medical evaluators, cumulative trauma claims are more likely than specific injury claims, that is, to include frictional costs such as liens and medical legal costs. So for frictional costs such as liens and medical legal costs, The reason that cumulative trauma injury claims are so high in these associated and ancillary costs is because many times these claims come to us as denied claims. It seems that claims administrators, in a knee-jerk reflexive reaction upon receiving a claim for industrial injury that involves cumulative trauma, the reflexive reaction is to simply deny the claim to give the claims administrator a period of time to investigate industrial causation for the claim. Well, during the period of denial or during the period of investigation by the claims administrator, many times these claimants pursue medical treatment for a claim that's been denied. They pursue medical treatment outside of the medical provider network. So treatment outside of the medical provider network is always provided on a lien basis. So these cases involve liens, much more so than specific injury claims for which the claim is accepted, for which benefits in the form of medical treatment are provided to the injured worker on an accepted basis through the medical provider network. So liens become not necessary as the employer directs the treatment and directs the medical treatment under the medical provider network. Whereas on a denied case, the examinee, the injured worker, the employee has no option but to jump outside of the medical provider network for which treatment services, medical treatment services are denied, and therefore the treatment has to be rendered and received on a lien basis. So these cases involve a lot of liens, and we'll talk about those liens as we go through our discussion in our next session. And then the medical legal costs involve our evaluations as qualified medical evaluators, generally to provide an opinion on compensability under Labor Code 4060 when these cases come to us as denied cases, or later on in the case of an accepted cumulative trauma injury claim, these cases come to us for a determination of the important issues, including permanent impairment, and then of course the apportionment of the permanent impairment. So much more so than specific injury claims, these claims are costly claims for the claims administrator, and we'll talk exactly about how you can effectively and accurately resolve the disputed issues on the difficult issues such as AOE, COE, permanent impairment, and the apportionment approximate percentages in these difficult types of cumulative trauma injury claims. Okay, so with regards to cumulative trauma injuries, it seems that qualified medical evaluators struggle to understand the concept of a cumulative trauma injury, an injury that occurs due to repetitive and cumulative activities occurring over a period of time. So let's see what the 2016 Physician's Guide has to say about specific injuries, about cumulative trauma injuries, and how to identify what actually qualifies or what actually constitutes a compensable injury in the California workers' compensation system. Now, because these cumulative trauma allegations of claims come to us many times as denied claims, the first issue that we need to master as qualified medical evaluators has to do with the AOE COE determination under Labor Code 4060. Because these cases come to us as denied claims, it's the compensability determination that we're being called upon to render and resolve. So before we get to the compensability determination, and I have a lot to say about how you can specifically go about arriving at an accurate determination, before we get to that, let's come to an agreement and a common understanding as to what qualifies under California workers' compensation as an actual compensable injury. What is it that constitutes an injury under the California workers' compensation system? Well, for some definitions, we can turn to the 2016 Physician's Guide that gives us some general principles upon which we can rely when it comes time to render these difficult decisions. So in the 2016 Physician's Guide, there's a couple of specific nuances in the language that I believe are important for us as qualified medical evaluators to consider. For example, what is the difference between first aid versus an injury? Some employees will suffer conditions at their place of employment that does not constitute an injury, that simply constitutes a first aid rendering of medical treatment versus medical treatment rendered for an actual, by law, definition of injury. So first of all, let's define first aid. First aid is the one-time treatment and any follow-up visit for the purpose of observation of minor scratches, cuts, burns, splinters, and so forth, sprains, strains, nicks, cuts, tweaks, twanks, which do not ordinarily require medical care. And many conditions fall under the scope or the realm of first aid and do not qualify as an actual injury that requires medical care. So for example, an employee drops a heavy box on his foot and goes to the company nurse, and the company nurse puts some ice on the injured foot and sends the employee home from work an hour or two early. And the injured employee comes back the next morning, reports to the occupational nurse. The occupational nurse determines that there's no injury been suffered. The injured employee is seemingly fine. The matter drops off and there's no further medical care required. That qualifies as first aid versus a compensable and bona fide industrial injury. Now, interestingly, in first aid cases, the employer is not required to complete the employer's report of occupational injury because the condition did not rise to the level of injury. However, and this is where sometimes controversies arise, the provider of medical services is required to complete a doctor's first report of occupational injury or illness, even in the cases of first aid. So many times these cases come to us and there's no reporting of an injury because the employer is not required by law to complete the employer's report. And also the doctor's first report sometimes gets disappeared from the file or doesn't make its way into the medical records that are sent to us as the qualified medical evaluator. And it seems that two things are occurring. Number one, there was never any report of any injury incident. And number two, there was no medical treatment required or rendered, no first aid treatment required or even rendered. And so this creates a controversy related to the need for medical care, and also, even before that, whether or not the employee properly reported the industrial injury. And as we talked about earlier, this is why these cases come to us as qualified medical evaluators for our determinations, specifically regarding AOE and COE. Okay, so that's first aid. Let's now talk about then, beyond first aid, what constitutes an injury and what constitutes a condition that actually requires medical care under the workers' compensation system. So for our definitions of injury, we turn to Labor Code 3208. 3208 provides three circumstances wherein an employee can qualify for an industrial injury, either specific and or cumulative trauma injury. So circumstance number one is any injury or any disease that arises out of employment. And you'll notice this is the AOE arising out of employment. So an injury refers to any injury to the neuromusculoskeletal integumentary system. Any system of the body really can suffer injury. Or disease, we typically think of the occupational diseases such as hypertension, such as asbestosis, such as skin disorders resulting from prolonged chemical exposure. So injuries or diseases that arise out of employment and that can be traced to the employment activities qualify under Labor Code 3208 as an industrial injury. And that constitutes the majority of the cases that we're going to see. Now, also, any derivative injury caused by treatment of an injury arising out of employment. In other words, here's the initial injury. This is from this definition above, an injury arising out of employment. If an employee suffers a derivative injury caused by the treatment for that injury, that qualifies as an injury under Labor Code 3208. So, for example, I had an injured worker who was claiming an injury to the lumbar spine. He had an injury to the lumbar spine. It was an accepted case. And the injured worker was pursuing treatment for the lumbar spine. And on one particular day, he went for treatment to his primary treating physician. He attended the treatment. He left the treatment. And on his way home at the freeway, he was stopped on the on-ramp of the freeway. And he was rear-ended on his way home. So the rear end injury, which caused an injury to the cervical spine now, a derivative injury here to the cervical spine, the cervical spine injury was compensable under workers' compensation because he was on his way home from the treatment for the industrial injury to the lumbar spine. Had it not been for the industrial injury to the lumbar spine, he would have not gone home in that particular direction. He would not have used the freeway. He would have not even been there had it not been for the original compensable workers' compensation injury. So the cervical spine condition qualified, and he received medical treatment for the cervical spine condition under a new date of injury as a workers' compensation injury. And then finally, any reaction to or any side effect from preventive health care the employer provides to healthcare workers qualifies as an industrial injury. And this is going to be important as we move forward in the coronavirus and post-coronavirus era, where healthcare workers have been required to undergo vaccinations against the COVID-19 virus. I'm sure there's going to be cases where healthcare workers have suffered effects or side effects or reactions to these vaccinations, which will be compensable under workers' compensation. Now, I once had a case where a registered nurse at his particular hospital where he worked, it might even have been specific to his unit or his floor or his department, but they were required to undergo a series of warm-up stretches prior to initiating their work shift at this particular department in a hospital. And this injured worker suffered a minor strain injury to the lower back and the sacroiliac joint area of his spine from overstretching in an effort to prevent injuries. In other words, this stretching and exercise regimen was required to help them prevent injuries, when in fact, in his case, it actually caused an injury to the lumbar spine, and he was able to have his claim accepted and receive treatment under workers' compensation. Surprisingly, when I saw this injured worker, he was fully recovered, and he was ready to get back to his full and unrestricted work duties without permanent impairment. So that in itself completed the surprise of this particular case, which was certainly an unusual circumstance, but I'm sure you can imagine many other types of potential injuries that could arise under this particular provision. Okay, so these are the three scenarios that qualify for industrial injury. Let's delve a little bit deeper into what actually constitutes, therefore, an injury. So, under Labor Code 3208, any injury or disease that arises out of employment, any derivative injury, or any reaction to or side effect from ... These are the three scenarios that qualify for injury in the California workers' compensation system. So imagine this: you're a qualified medical evaluator and you're trying to determine, does the examinee have an injury or disease arising out of employment? Does he have a derivative injury caused by treatment? Or does the examinee have a reaction to or side effect, any of which could constitute an injury under California workers' compensation? So this is very, very difficult. So let's back up just a little bit and let's focus in each of these scenarios under Labor Code 3208 as to what it is that constitutes, what it is that qualifies, what it is that beyond first aid rises to the level of a compensable injury in California workers' compensation. Once we can define injury, then we can clearly delineate and differentiate specific injuries from cumulative trauma injuries, and then we can get into our determination on AOE, COE compensability for these denied cumulative trauma injury claims that come to us. So our definition of an injury comes from the 2016 Physician's Guide, where they tell us, and this is the definition of an injury, and this is critical for us as qualified medical evaluators to understand. It tells us that in order for a condition to be considered an injury, it must ... and here comes some criteria that a condition must have for that condition to rise to the level of an industrial injury. So before we get to the criteria, let's focus in here on the condition. This is critical for us to understand. So in order for an employee, a claimant, an examinee to qualify as an industrial injury, as having an industrial injury, they must first have a condition. According to the 2016 Physician's Guide, it says in order for a condition to be considered an injury, ... couple criteria. So there must first be a condition. There must be a condition. So imagine this, you're with an employee who's claiming an industrial injury. He's claiming perhaps a cumulative trauma injury, and you go through your history and you go through the physical examination, and the examinee provides a perfectly normal physical examination. In other words, you're unable through physical examination to identify a bona fide symptomatic condition. A bona fide symptomatic condition, you're unable to identify any condition. Examinee has no condition, then there can be no industrial injury. First and foremost, the examinee must have a condition. And then once you identify a condition, the condition is subject to a few criteria before it can then rise to the level, the lofty level of an industrial injury in the California workers' compensation system. So first and foremost, there must be a condition. No condition equals no injury. A condition, a present condition, examinee who actually has a condition does not necessarily have an industrial injury under California workers' compensation if the criteria are not met. So simply the presence of a condition does not constitute an industrial injury. So your first determination, and here's a heads up as we get to the AOE, COE determination, the first determination for you as a qualified medical evaluator is, does the examinee have or not have a bona fide symptomatic diagnosable condition? If you find a condition, then the condition must be subject to a couple criteria before it can qualify as an industrial injury. So according to the 2016 Physician's Guide, the condition in order to qualify as an industrial injury must cause either disability and or a need for medical treatment. The condition must meet a couple criteria. It must, number one, cause disability. Now, what is disability? Disability, it refers to an interference with the employee's normal work duties. So disability can fall along a spectrum. At the far end of the spectrum would be a case that involves total temporary disability, where the examinee is completely off work, temporarily disabled, due to the condition. So that's at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is some minor or lesser form of disability, such as a medically prescribed work restriction. So this examinee has a work restriction of no sitting greater than 60 minutes. He returns to work with this temporary partial disability. Partial work restriction is a partial disability due to the condition. So if the examinee suffers disability, either some minor work restriction all the way to total temporary disability, that condition qualifies as an industrial injury. If there's no disability, the examinee has a condition, some condition, a sore back, sore shoulder, painful ankle, gastric reflux, whatever, but that condition does not cause disability. It does not qualify as an industrial injury under the California Workers' Compensation System. And this is one of the difficulties that we're going to see in the cases that involve post-employment cumulative trauma allegations, is that the claims are filed post-employment, and during the employment period, the employee never demonstrated disability. The employee continued working in their full and unrestricted work duties until such time that they were laid off, retired, terminated, quit, took a sabbatical, whatever, and never suffered any work disability during that period of time. This makes the determination of the presence or an absence of an industrial injury very, very difficult. Now, secondly, is that the condition must cause a need for medical treatment. And I'm going to share with you some cases that distinguish which of these two criteria is the more critical, which of the two is more defining of an injury, which of the two is more required for an industrial injury. But on our first pass through this concept, according to the 2016 Physician's Guide, it must cause a need for medical treatment. This is what distinguishes an injury from first aid. First aid doesn't require follow-up medical treatment. The matter simply drops off. But an injury creates a need for medical treatment. This also is one of the areas of difficulty that we face when it comes time to opine on AOE-COE for cumulative trauma claims. For a condition, the examinee may actually have a bona fide condition that has not needed medical treatment, and based on your physical examination of the examinee, may not be expected to respond favorably to medical treatment. If there's no need for medical treatment, then the condition does not qualify as an industrial injury. On the other hand, if you identify a bona fide condition, the examinee has a bona fide symptomatic diagnosable condition that was expected to respond to medical treatment, then that would qualify as an industrial injury under California Workers' Compensation. So it's an interesting mental flow sheet that we as qualified medical evaluators need to employ in arriving first at a determination: does the employee have an injury? And then number two, is that injury compensable under California Workers' Compensation? And it first and foremost rests on the presence or absence of a bona fide, symptomatic, and diagnosable condition. Okay? So once we identify a condition and we determine that condition rises to the level of an industrial injury, then it becomes important for us to distinguish between specific injuries and cumulative trauma types of injuries. Okay, so the mental flow sheet is, number one, does the employee have a condition? Is there a bona fide, symptomatic, diagnosable condition present? If the examinee has a condition that you identify through your physical examination, then that condition may qualify as an injury. But first and foremost, there has to be a condition present. Then once you identify a condition, you run the condition through the criteria. Does that condition, is there evidence that it's caused or is causing work disability? And or does that condition, is that condition reasonably expected to respond to medical treatment? or is it a condition that does not need active and ongoing medical treatment? Okay, so you run the condition through the criteria. If your condition successfully passes the criteria and you determine that the condition qualifies as an injury, then the game begins. The game can then begin once you identify an injury. And the next step in the game is to identify whether or not the injury qualifies as either a specific injury or a cumulative trauma type of injury. Now, a specific injury is very easy for us as qualified medical evaluators to understand, and the definition is quite clear. A specific injury occurs as a result of a single incident or exposure. This is very easy to understand. Imagine a Costco worker who's unloading a pallet full of cases of Dasani water, and on picking up one particular case of Dasani water suffers a injury to the lower back lumbar spine. That occurred as a result of a single incident or exposure that occurred at a defined and precise moment in time. That's a specific incident of injury. So with these cumulative trauma claims, we're going to be seeing that we receive one of three types of evaluations. We receive an evaluation either for a specific injury claim, we receive a request for an evaluation of a cumulative trauma injury claim, or we receive a request for an evaluation of a claim that involves both components. It involves a claim of a specific incident of injury with a cumulative trauma component. So the specific injury may likely be active in those cases that appear to be cumulative trauma types of claims only. In other words, many of the claims that we're evaluating involve components of both, specific incidences of injury and then also periods of cumulative trauma. Now, cumulative trauma is a little bit more difficult to understand and grasp a hold of, it seems, for qualified medical evaluators, particularly when it comes to opining on industrial causation, AOE, COE. So first, let's begin by getting the definition of a cumulative trauma injury. Cumulative trauma injury results from repetitive physical or mental trauma over a period of time. Critically, the combined effect of which causes disability, any disability, from a minor work restriction all the way to total temporary disability. In other words, any form of temporary partial disability all the way to total temporary total disability, or need for medical treatment. So with a cumulative trauma injury, it's due to repetitive trauma over time, which eventually causes disability and or need for medical treatment. Now, these components or these criteria that it must cause disability or must cause a need for medical treatment are critical for us to, as qualified medical evaluators, to assess and to pursue in our history taking with the examinee. If the condition does not cause disability and has not caused the need for medical treatment, then there is no cumulative trauma injury. But when any disability or need for medical treatment combined with the employee's knowledge that the disability or the need for medical treatment was actually due to repetitive physical or mental trauma over a period of time, these factors, these criteria collide and coincide to contribute to a bona fide actual cumulative trauma injury that becomes compensable under the California Workers' Compensation System. Now, in our next session, I want to talk to you about those cases where you identify an actual cumulative trauma injury. I want to talk to you about how to establish the date of injury for a cumulative trauma injury. This is important when determining liability among multiple and various insurers. So it's critical to understand some key concepts related to the date of injury for CT claims. Then I want to talk to you about the post-employment, the specific circumstance that involves the post-employment filing of a claim for industrial cumulative trauma. This is a specific species of claim that you're going to be seeing more and more of in the weeks, months, and years ahead, especially if you're in Southern California. So these types of claims, these post-employment cumulative trauma claims, have a specific and precise handling, and it begins with an understanding of injury, first of all, and also the date of injury related to cumulative trauma types of injuries. So doctors, look forward to being with you on our next session as we continue our fascinating investigation into the growing universe of cumulative trauma claims. So for today, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I want to thank you for joining me today, and I'm looking forward to being with you on our next session as well. For now, I'm wishing you best of success in your career as a qualified medical evaluator.